Hey everyone, welcome to the first of what I've decided to call an interview with, and I'm delighted that the first guest is Professor Neil Walsh from Liverpool John Moores University. So Neil, thank you for being the, I don't want to say pilot, but being the first in this series.
Thank you.
So the idea of this came about that now we're all quarantined and we're working remotely. You know, I've had a few great conversations with colleagues at John Moores University over the last few weeks, and one of them was with yourself, Neil, where I was asking some questions about immune function, etc. And I just thought that if I'm interested, someone who's so-called an expert in this field myself, I'm sure that lots of other people would be, and I use that term expert loosely. I'm sure that the wider population would be interested. So I thought we would do this, and each week speak to a different expert from Liverpool John Moores and share it with the wider community. So let's see how it goes. And obviously with your background and with what's going on at the moment, it made perfect sense to start with immune function. So if I just kick off, Neil, by saying, taking aside what's going on at the moment, in terms of exercise immunology, how important do you think that is for athletes to have an understanding of, and perhaps more importantly, the coaching staff to have an understanding of?
Yeah, it's very important. I mean, there's good evidence now that after injury, illness and infection is the second most commonly cited reason for underperformance and missing training in athletes. So it's really important. We also know that medal winners tend to suffer fewer and shorter lasting infections. One way of looking at this is that sickness really correlates negatively with training volume. The more sick you are, the less you can train. So we need to do whatever we can to keep athletes training. And the situation is important because athletes might often try and push on through and actually train when they've got an infection. And things can get much more serious then, Graeme, because if you train, we always say, don't train with below the neck symptoms. But if you train with an infection, you can extend the ongoing infection, you can make it worse, and it can even lead to medical emergencies. So, we really recommend against athletes training when they're sick.
I think that's a really important point because, in my other world where, as an applied practitioner, there's probably still particularly in some of the sports where I work, the macho side of things where, people almost don't want to report an illness and would see it as being, almost soft to report an illness. But the point that you just said there about extending it, if we've got a better understanding of the immune system, we can probably get rid of that quicker and then compete better at the weekend.
Yeah, exactly.
So bearing that in mind, do you think it'd be useful to give almost a whistle-stop tour of the immune system at the key things that we're talking about and what should people be aware of?
Yeah, I think as will probably all come up in this podcast, we now look beyond the stress and strains of exercise to life stress and what have you in terms of stress, anxiety, sleep, and all those factors we know can zap the immune system. I typically, when I teach the immune system, I always say that there's two arms to the immune system. You've got your innate immune system. Firstly, we're talking about skin as a barrier, antimicrobial proteins in ocular fluid and in saliva, of course. Those are your first line of defense. And then you've got your second line of defense, which involves innate immune cells, phagocytes like neutrophils and monocytes. And they're very good at gobbling up, if you like, bacteria and the likes and killing in that way. They're a bit nondescript at doing this, but they also work very closely and coordinate with the third line of defense, the acquired immune system, which are our lymphocytes predominantly. And here we're talking about the production of antibodies by B lymphocytes and cell-mediated killing, real sharp shooting, if you like, by the cytotoxic T cells and what have you. And it's important we teach that the innate and the acquired immune system, that there's some crosstalk, because the monocytes of the innate immune system have that first meeting with the nasty, if you like, and they present some of the particles of that nasty to the lymphocytes of the acquired immune system. So there's always crosstalk, and this is one of the challenges in exercise immunology, because we often take blood samples and separate the cells from their normal environment. And we know that the best measures of immunity with most clinical relevance are those that ask the immune system to make a coordinated response. So, for example, you don't want to separate cells from their normal environment now. You want to challenge the immune system to do what it does inside the body and see how exercise affects that. There are various ways you can do this. You can look at the immune response to vaccinations, for example. You can use skin tests. But certainly we recommend these in vivo type challenges to assess immunity. And unfortunately, very few studies in exercise immunology have looked at in vivo challenges. Most of them tend to measure things like antibodies in saliva, tears, and what have you. And there is a good rationale for that, because more than 90% of all infections we suffer are initiated at the mucosal surfaces. But still, the greatest clinical relevance is by using sort of integrated immune measures in our studies, Graeme.
Okay, there's loads to pick up on and delve into. And I think it's probably worth mentioning at the moment when you talked about our first defence being the skin and them physical barriers, which is probably why, in some ways athletes can become a little bit more prone to infection, would you say, because of the fact that, them initial physical barriers are probably compromised more than general public?
Yeah, I think that you only have to watch athletes and their behaviors, that, we need to really make sure we do the basics very well. Of course, my mantra in all my talks about hand hygiene, now everybody accepts that in the COVID-19 world. Yeah. But actually avoiding touching our eyes, our nose and our mouth, so important for any of these respiratory viruses. Self-inoculation is what we're really doing there. So, avoiding touching these things, the first portal of entry. And of course, the immunity at those surfaces has been a foci of interest for exercise immunologists, mostly because it's quite convenient to collect saliva and tears, but also because, of course, this is the place where many of these viruses now get their entry.
Yeah, it gets me thinking that a lot of the sports teams that I work in, common practice every morning is that 50 or 60 people come straight in, shake hands with each other, and sit down and eat breakfast. Now, I know we're in a world of no handshakes at the moment and hand sterilisation, but do you think moving beyond COVID, as an athlete population, we may need to start thinking about things such as simple things as hand hygiene and handshakes?
Most definitely, they should be top of the agenda.
Okay, so moving on to the next question, I kind of touched on it a minute ago where I said, athletes being more susceptible. I remember when I was being taught exercise immunology at school, people were talking about the J-shaped curve, athletes being more susceptible when they train hard, but protected when they train moderately. Do you want to maybe put some context on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, this all started in the 80s and early 90s when there was a series of studies on marathon runners showing that in the days and weeks after a marathon, that there seemed to be an increased, at least reporting of upper respiratory symptoms or common cold symptoms in the weeks after races, important marathons and ultra marathons. And this, along with studies showing changes in immune cell counts in the blood in the hours after exercise, and even immune function drops off a little bit in the hours after heavy exercise. It seemed to be that there was this open window that was talked about a lot, whereby in the hours after heavy exercise, your immune system, the field thought, was a little bit zapped, and that you'd be more prone to picking up infections. But the problem here is that actually the studies only reported symptoms of infections, and they didn't sort of take swabs, if you like. We're all familiar with swabs now and pathological analysis to actually detect the viruses. So that was one of the weaknesses. They weren't always tightly controlled studies either in the marathon runners, because of course you have to control exposure to the pathogens, etc. as well. And the more contemporary and reasoned approach now is that there are a number of risk factors for infection in athletes. We know infection is a problem for athletes, as I alluded to earlier. So we know, for example, that the autumn winter for all of us, irrespective of athletic status, that's a major risk for respiratory infections. Poor hygiene and exposure to sick people, we know that's another big risk. In athletes who had recent symptoms of infections tend to go on and more likely develop a full-blown cold or what have you. Air travel increases the risk of infection some 3 to 5 times. So does poor sleep. Poor sleep is a problem. We've done studies on stress, anxiety, and depression. And we'll talk, I think, about low energy availability in a moment. But studies in the 90s tended to show that if you went on a training camp or went to competition, that you'd be more likely to pick up an infection. But with this new knowledge about the multi-stressor effects on immunity, actually it's really hard to sort of disentangle whether it's the increased training on a training camp that increases infection, or the fact that the athletes just, had a stressful few days traveling through airports and on an airplane. They may have upset sleep. They may be worried about decisions that will be made on the training camp about team selection. They've got all of these factors that might increase infection incidence when they're heavily training on a camp. So we're sort of looking back at the old studies now through a new lens, if you like, Graeme.
Yeah, that picks up beautifully on a follow-up to that, which is, I've said to you before that you showed me a slide about 3 years ago when you was giving a guest lecture to my students 3 years ago. And to be honest, it was that lecture where I spoke with my colleague Daphne and said, we've got to get Neil to John Moores. We need this fella at LJMU. But it was all about the cognitive appraisal of a given task and how the cognitive appraisal then affects the physiology. So how the psychology affects the physiology. And that was almost like a eureka moment for me, because it suddenly began to explain a lot of things that I've been seeing in the applied world, where some people having a really good response to something, others not so much. I just wonder whether you could maybe talk us through, if you can remember that slide, but basically the theory behind that, each individual's unique stress response will affect the physiology.
Yeah, and this has been a key moment for me with my team, and I don't know where this really started. I think one of the things that really started me looking to the dark arts, if you like, the psychological factors, was when we produced a position stand in 2011 in Exercise Immunology Review on this subject. I do remember the great Roy Shepherd. I'm sure we've all read tens of papers by Roy Shepherd, one of the most published sports scientists in history. Roy made us make a distinction in the abstract and the early parts of that position stand between exercise for exercise sake and sport and competition. And at the time, the prevailing notion was that heavy exercise, no matter how you were doing it, would zap the immune system, which of course we've discussed. And this kind of set me on a path really to look beyond just this person's done exercise at 60% max for 2 hours, and this person's done it, which we were doing in the lab, all these kind of studies with various exercise models, and to actually entertain that it's all in the interpretation that the individual has about the challenge you put in front of them. And you have to go back some 100 years really to the great Cellier's work. He gave us the term stress, and Walter B. Cannon's work on stress and anxiety responses. They talked about a general adaptation model for stress. It didn't matter what sort of stress it was, whether it was anxiety causing worry, whether it was long-term stress, whether it was physical exercise. It was really down to the human or the animal's interpretation of this as whether it was pleasant or aversive. And then we have then the two axes of the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis, which modulates the immune system, the fight or flight response. And of course, we have the slower moving hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which gives rise to immune modulating hormones like cortisol. So before that point, we just had those two pathways. And then in the paper, I think the paper you're referring to, I wrote in EJSS, has these extra bubbles showing, well, you've got the cognitive appraisal of the demand, which dictates everything that then happens from then on, and how we look at this subject, Graeme.
Yeah, and the example I've used in applied practice quite a bit is the ice bath. Now, I know some players will tell me that they feel so much better having had an ice bath, and I know other players who say actually they feel worse having had one. When we look at the literature, we've kind of talked about a mean effect, and there's responders and non-responders. And it would be really good, I think, to really look at that literature and say, are the people who are having a negative response. If everyone's like me, a bit nesh, don't like the cold, and actually would have quite an adverse stress response to getting in. And there's other people who just love to jump in an ice bath post-training, and they probably have a really positive response to it.
And this there are parallels now in the world of exercise immunology. We were startled a couple of years ago. One of my PhD students, Jason Edwards, we published a study showing that the individual's level of anxiety and perceived stress when they arrived at the lab before doing a bout of exercise explained much of the subsequent immune response to exercise. Before that moment, before we thought about the appraisal of the situation, we would have just assumed that very heavy exercise will zap the immune system more than very light exercise. We've made no account or taken no account of the fact that for some individuals, they would quite like to do 1 or 2 hours of exercise, but for others that they might be scared of somebody in the lab, or they, even though we familiarize them, they might not like needles so much, or, and there is anxiety related to that. And the rather scary thing is there are about 4,000 papers on exercise and immunity right now. And I can tell you that there are only a very small handful of papers that have actually assessed levels of psychological stress and anxiety and controlled for them in their observations of how the exercise affects immunity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good take-home message at the moment. One of the many, but and I'm thinking about young players making a debut, and what the stress and anxiety would be that week for that player. Some people take it in the stride, some people don't, and about preparing them to maximise your immune response as well as all the other factors that go with it. Look, I want to switch it now onto nutrition, obviously. So we're talking about, what can we do to maybe help the immune system. And then I go back to another one of your papers where you recently published talking about a new paradigm when it comes to the immune health in athletes, where you're now differentiating between immune resistance and immune tolerance. And again, that was another real eye-opener for myself, and has probably changed the way I try and educate within the applied world, trying to help people from an immune perspective. Do you just want to basically summarize that resistance versus tolerance and how that's important for us to understand from a nutrition perspective?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, we used to teach that you have your effector cells that do the killing on one side of a balanced scales, if you like, and then on the other side you have your regulatory cells that dampen the immune system, and that to achieve optimal immunity you would have to balance those scales. We never really included the pathogen, the baddie, the nasty in this. Of course, it was either a lot of killing or a lot of downplaying the immune system. On the one hand, if you have overly strong effector responses, you may suffer autoimmune diseases, allergic diseases. The immune system's overly exuberant. And the problem with that is, of course, you will have excessive damage to your tissues too, because the immune system will cause damage. Oxidative stress, for example, will cause damage. And it will use up a lot of your energy and resources. And the greatest example of that is actually in invertebrates. In studies in bumblebees, for example, some bumblebees in these studies were severely malnourished, some were well fed, and when they challenged their immune system to fully respond, the bumblebees that were starved tended to die, showing the full impact of a large immune response, the impact it has in terms of damage in energy resources. On the other hand, we used to think that if you've got a weak effector immune system, we used to think athletes might suffer with this back in the 90s, that you'd have immune deficiency, increased risk of infections, cancer, and so on. But then I read a paper by Ayers and Schneider in Annual Reviews of Immunology way back in 2012 that changed all of that for me. Their work's mostly in ecology, of invertebrates like the bumblebees and so on, and the insect work. And in that world of immunology, they entertain the terms resistance and tolerance. They said that if you use, for example, a metaphor of a castle or a fortress for the immune system has to build the walls of the castle. It has to repair them in a fight. It has to have offspring, just like the immune system does, and share resources. And it has to do all of these things, but at the same time, it has to decide if it wants to go into battle. And so they sort of suggested we need a new way of describing how the immune system works. And that's the model of resistance and tolerance in the sports medicine paper that I presented. And I've applied that now to our world, where what you have is your resistance is your killing weaponry to reduce the pathogen burden. And we used to think, Graeme, that the killing weaponry was almost clinically deficient in athletes. And we now have revisited that. We're not sure that in many cases that athletes ever become, they're typically healthy individuals, that they become really immune suppressed. But yet in the 90s and the noughties, we did tens of studies giving supplements to improve immune resistance, and then were surprised when we saw that actually there wasn't really many benefits of those supplements for resistance. But if you apply this model of tolerance, which is about keeping pathogens at a level that doesn't make you sick, but living in kind of harmony with them. Really good example, of course, are the bacteria in your gut, the mutualistic bacteria that do us some good. And that supports, of course, a model of tolerance. Then if you look at these tolerogenic supplements and you look back at the literature where there were cases of studies that had given tolerogenic supplements, you tend to see that actually there were benefits in those studies in terms of, for example, not necessarily reducing the incidence of infection, but reducing the severity and duration. And that fits with a model of tolerance, because you would expect that if you can dampen the immune system with tolerogenic supplements, that you would suffer a shorter or less severe infection. And it also, for me, changes the way we might make our measurements in our studies with athletes. No longer are we just worried about whether an athlete gets sick. It's about how sick do they really get, and whether by improving tolerance, you can sort of reduce the severity and reduce the duration of the infection, Graeme.
Yeah, and I think that's huge. Again, coming from the applied world, yes, some athletes get sick, but as you say, can we keep them at a level of sickness whereby they can still train, compete, particularly compete? We said early on we might pull them from training a little bit, but can we get them out on the field at the weekend? So from a nutrition perspective, I've read a lot recently about low energy availability. I'm thinking about both sides of that, the resistance and the tolerance. Is a low energy intake or a low energy availability, is that an immune problem for athletes?
Well, there's an enormous amount of interest in this topic now. I'm thinking Red-S, of course, and then there were a couple papers by the Australian Institute of Sport that have shown that in a population of female elite athletes, that they used the LEAF questionnaire, the low energy availability in females, that questionnaire, and they showed that females with low energy availability have 7 times increased risk of illnesses such as respiratory infections compared with those who do not have low energy availability. However, they also concede in the study that they had quite a small number of infectious episodes in their study, only 16, but also it was impossible for them to separate out the low energy availability from depression, anxiety, and psychological stress that also in those females increased the incidence of illness by 8 times. So I think we need sort of high quality studies to determine whether low energy availability really does zap the immune system in otherwise healthy athletes. I often, you will recall that I often talk about the cases, there's in my idea is that there's 3 lines of evidence that suggest that probably low energy availability does not clinically zap the immune system in athletes. And the first piece of evidence is that anorexia nervosa seems to be protective against upper respiratory tract infection. There's good evidence, actually, quite paradoxically almost, that when in advanced cases of anorexia, the patients are refed, that actually you tend to see more respiratory tract infections then. Wow. And that the immune system's actually really quite well preserved until the really advanced cases when, BMI is below 15, for example, and you only see increases in this hormone people believe that zaps the immune system, cortisol, when anorexics fast for prolonged periods. Similarly, another piece of evidence comes from kwashiorkor, from protein energy malnutrition. again, the immune system's quite well sustained until the really advanced situation in protein energy malnutrition. And work in female athletes, you know, tends to show, even those who have low energy availability, that the levels of cortisol we don't think are raised in low energy availability, but also one of the key nutrients, macronutrients, that's important to maintain immunity is protein. And studies, I know one of them by Hecura in International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism, you know, the protein intakes in those females who were had low energy availability, they were amenorrheic in cases, were over 2 grams per kilo body mass per day. So I don't believe the evidence is clearly definitive yet to show that low energy availability really truly zaps the immune system in athletes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested where you picked up on protein, because again, I go back 20 years when I was an undergraduate being taught all this, and protein wasn't really talked about from being a key macronutrient for the immune system. What we was always taught was this triangle of carbohydrate, decreased plasma glucose, increased cortisol, immunosuppression. Am I right in thinking that people have now started to move more towards considering protein more important than carbohydrate when it comes to the immune system?
Yeah, so I think in terms of maintaining immunity, it's very, very important that you meet your protein requirements. And of course, you will know better than I that most athletes will do that. Really excellent work in mice and some in humans shows that in energy deficiency and protein deficiency, just adding a little bit of protein back into the diets of the mice and the rats restores normal immunity relatively quickly. It seems to be the protein that's important. And that might also be the case in anorexia nervosa individuals who actually typically restrict carbohydrate and fat, and protein is typically adequate, potentially explaining why their immune system is typically intact.
Yeah, so there's another suggestion here that, you know, athletes who are maybe reducing their energy intake at the moment because their energy expenditure has dropped quite a lot, probably shouldn't be slicing this, probably for not only for preservation of muscle mass, but probably important to keep the protein intake pretty high over the next few weeks.
Yeah, certainly they need to meet the recommendations. Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So my final bits of questions from a nutrition perspective is that, you know, there are certain micronutrients that have been discussed from an immune perspective. The 3 that jump out at me that I'm going to ask, you've already mentioned probiotics, so I'll leave that one alone for now. But vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc, or particularly zinc acetate. I just wonder if it's worth a short discussion of, at the moment, should we be increasing our vitamin C? Should we be increasing our vitamin D? And then maybe a comment on zinc.
Yeah, and of course, vitamin C has great potential as a tolerogenic supplement. It's antioxidant effects, of course. There are some studies, 5 or 6 studies from the 90s actually, that showed that vitamin C supplementation, in one of them by Edith Peters' group in AJCN way back when in 93, they gave 600 milligrams of vitamin C per day in the weeks before and after the Comrades Marathon in South Africa. And they saw quite, you know, profound beneficial effects on the reports of common cold symptoms. And we've talked about some of the weaknesses of those symptom studies, but they did show benefits. And there are a number of other studies that show in not the general population, but in athletes and military personnel under high physical demand, so high oxidative stress, that vitamin C supplementation does seem to actually halve the incidence of upper respiratory tract infections. Now, we don't know, Graeme, whether this is true infection because we haven't got the pathology from those studies, of course. They're just symptomology. So that's a weakness for sure. And it's been suggested by Harry Hemmeler and his team that this might be due to an effect of vitamin C on reducing exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, respiratory damage and the like. But, you know, nevertheless, there seems to be beneficial effects of vitamin C supplementation on infection. And you and I have had conversations about, you know, this idea that, yes, that might be the case, but vitamin C might blunt training adaptations. But I think you agree with me, I hazard, that actually whether this sort of level of vitamin C supplementation would truly reduce training adaptations in good standard athletes is not clear, Graeme. Is that your take?
That's exactly my take. Myself and James Cobley wrote a review on this a few years ago now in Free Radical Biology and Medicine. I'm becoming less and less convinced about that blocking adaptations, particularly down at the 500 milligram where we're talking about there. So, if that has been shown to have a good effect, and I'm convinced it doesn't affect adaptations, it probably would make sense to either increase our fruit juice at the moment to get some vitamin C that way, some red bell peppers, etc., or look at a 500 milligram supplementation. The other one I wanted you to touch on, Neil, an area that we're both fascinated with is vitamin D, but I'm going to ask you because from an immune perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we've covered this ground quite a bit before. I think that now is a very important time of year where in the UK the sun is coming out for individuals to practice safe sunlight exposure. You can become vitamin D sufficient by just exposing for 10-12 minutes a day, your arms, wearing a t-shirt and shorts. More than that can obviously cause burn and skin cancer risk. You don't need more than those few minutes each day when the sun is out to become sufficient for vitamin D. We know that vitamin D is very important for the innate immune system particularly. And, there are now good studies showing that upper respiratory tract infection incidence can be blunted a little by being sufficient in vitamin D, which is having, more than 50 nanomolar of the typical measurement of vitamin D in blood, 2,5-OHD. There was a really good meta-analysis in British Medical Journal by Martineau and Associates back in 2017 that showed the benefits of vitamin D supplementation to prevent acute respiratory infection. There are also some quite good studies in athletes that suggest that you really want to be sufficient for vitamin D. You do not want to be deficient for vitamin D to protect your immune system.
Yeah. I noticed even this week there was a paper that came out in Nutrients, which has even now associate COVID-19 with vitamin D status. Now, obviously, it's too early to make them type of assumptions, but given what we know about the importance of vitamin D, I'm completely with you that if we can't get some sunlight exposure, somewhere between maybe 1,000 and 2,000 international units per day of a vitamin D3 supplement could be beneficial. And if you can get 10 or 15 minutes of midday sun without burning, it's probably a good thing.
Agreed. And the BMJ article as well does highlight that there are distinct benefits from supplementing, of course, those who need it most. So screening is important. So those who are already, the most deficient, they benefit. But actually they showed very little benefit with bolus large doses, 30,000 IUs or more, did not benefit and reduce respiratory infection, whereas daily or weekly vitamin D supplementation, low dose vitamin D supplementation was beneficial. And of course, we recommend against, very high dosed vitamin D supplementation, risks of kidney stones and what have you. So that is very important that anybody who, screen first.
Yes.
And of course, supplement in safe doses. I mean, we showed, Graeme, that if you're insufficient in the winter, that only 1,000 IUs per day of vitamin D3 is required to, restore sufficiency in people who are, insufficient for vitamin D. And that was just during the autumn and winter.
Absolutely. And, European Food Standards Agency and US IOM have both set 4,000 as a safe upper limit. So it still shocks me that I see people talking about 10, 20, 40,000 international units. And as you know, we published a paper a few years ago to show that in athletic populations, 10,000 international units per day did have some negative effects. So I think that's a really important point. Look, I said we'd be on for about 15 minutes, and we're getting up to the 45-minute mark now. And actually, I could speak to you all day about this, and this is why I asked you to do this, Neil. But in terms of wrapping up, have you got any, like real nuggets you want to pass on for athletes at this time at the moment? Any, if you was sat down in front of one of my teams that I support and say, right, okay, guys, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 massive immune tips, what would you be telling them?
I mean, it's one that I've been proposing, putting out there for years, which has been knocked down a few times from people who say it's not practical, but now I think people will buy it, which is obviously try to avoid sick people, particularly in the autumn, winter time. Sometimes people say, well, that's not practical, you can't avoid them. But I think we might now be a little bit more receptive to that one. Ensuring good hygiene and proper vaccination schedules, avoiding self-inoculation always. Not training with below the neck symptoms is very, very important. And to, of course, given our earlier discussion, monitor and manage all forms of stress. I use the word carefully. It could be psychosocial stress. It could be the physical stress of training. We're very good at measuring the physical stress of training with our heart rate monitors and our power meters, etc., etc. But probably we need to think more about what happens when we're not actually training. I think we need to be aiming for good sleep. Normally we'd say about 7 hours or more of sleep a night. 7 to 8 hours would be recommended. And of course, eat a well-balanced diet so that you avoid any frank, deficits.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary on that. On that note, we can do, I was going to say a distant handshake, but we can't handshake anymore. So we might do a distant fist pump. A huge thanks for every time I speak to Neil, I learn something, and Matt's the same again. So hopefully everyone's enjoyed that, and this will be the first of a series of a conversation with me, where we show some of the expertise here within Liverpool John Moores University. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Graeme.